When Skyward Sword released, it was a very mixed game. Some people loved it and some hated it, but I think we can all agree the best part about this game is its dungeons. While there may not be as many as Twilight Princess or Ocarina of Time, there's still a good amount and they're all pretty good. But which ones are the best? Today we're going to be taking a look at each dungeon and rank them from worst to best. So let's go ahead and get started. In last place we have the Earth Temple. This is the only temple in this game that I think is pretty underwhelming. The rest of them are actually pretty enjoyable. This one just barely missed the mark for me. While this temple is called the Earth Temple, it's always felt more like a fire temple because of all the lava around. This dungeon is pretty short and also a bit forgettable as well, and I think the reason for that is because later in the game we actually get a fire temple that's quite a bit better than this one. The dungeon itself is pretty short and there isn't much that stands out. The aesthetics are fine but a bit boring, although I do really like the dragon head in the wall with lava coming out later in the dungeon. That's a nice touch. But for the most part, everything is just rocky and boring. Another thing I feel was lacking here a bit was the dungeon theme. It's not bad, but it definitely doesn't compete with some of the other dungeon themes. That being said, I do think it fits this dungeon quite well. It's just not one I would listen to a lot. And then we have the dungeon items, which is the bomb bag. It's pretty much an item we've seen in every Zelda game, so it's nothing too special. And it's definitely a downgrade to the cool item we got in the first dungeon before this one. But I will admit, the bombs are a bit more unique in this game, specifically because you can roll them, which can be a bit fun at times, and makes for some good puzzles like rolling the bomb through holes. But at the end of the day, it's just bombs. Then we have the big, I guess, gimmick of this dungeon, which is rolling around on a stone ball in the lava. You can use this ball to push switches and run over those lava enemies. This gimmick isn't bad, it's just a little slow and kind of boring. Especially the parts where you have to hop off the ball to blow something up and then hop back on. It can just be quite a slog. Then we have the boss, which is honestly my favorite part of this dungeon. It's a big fire rock with long legs and an eye as a weak point. What you want to do is wait for him to start sucking up, then chuck a bomb in his mouth. This isn't anything unique, in fact we've seen it many times before, one example being Dodongo, but it's still pretty fun. Overall the dungeon is pretty straightforward and just kinda generic with nothing that helps it stand out, which is why I put it in last place. Next up we have this game's final dungeon, Skykeep. Unlike most dungeons in Zelda, this one doesn't have an item to collect, although that's fine because it's near the end of the game. But there also isn't a boss either. You fight the final boss after the dungeon, which is a bit weird, but I guess it makes sense story-wise. The cool gimmick of this dungeon is you have a slider puzzle that lets you move the dungeon rooms around. It's a unique idea, but I gotta admit, I struggled with this. I'm terrible at slider puzzles and I got so lost here. Another cool thing is each room in the Skykeep are based off previous dungeons. You have a room that's like the Earth Temple, then you have a room that resembles Skyview Temple. This is a neat feature, but some of the rooms were really short and you were kind of in and out, while others were a bit more tedious. Personally to me, I feel like this dungeon was thrown together last minute just so the game would have a final dungeon. Another thing this dungeon struggles from is you get to it after the worst part of the game, which is getting the Song of the Hero. This part was so long and drawn out, and by the time I got to the Skykeep, I was ready for the game to be over. It also felt like it had been forever since we did the last dungeon. But I can't fault the temple for that, that's more of a problem with the overall game. But it is a really good dungeon that's just held back by the point in which you get to it. Next up we have the Sandship. First, let's discuss the elephant in the room being the boss Tantalus, aka Mike Wazowski's girlfriend who let herself go. Now a bunch of people really dislike this fight, and personally I think it's pretty good. I'm just not a fan of the boss's design. It looks pretty goofy, especially considering how cool the mini-boss was here. I like the opening to the fight, how the ship is beginning to sink and you gotta avoid the barrels rolling at you, and I also like near the end of the fight where Tantalus' snake hair starts coming at you. That part kinda freaked me out. The fight itself isn't bad, and yes it may be a bit easy, but most Zelda bosses usually are. As for the dungeon itself, the Sandship is pretty unique. Plus, it's another place that uses time shift stones. So you switch between the past where the Sandship is bright, colorful, and still working, and then there's a present where the Sandship is run down and full of sand. Now, I do think this place looks cool when it's in the past and everything is colorful, but when it's in the present, it's a very dull looking place, which doesn't really appeal much to me. Personally, I think the other dungeon that uses time shift stones does a much better job than this one. Most of the rooms in the Sandship are pretty boring, and the puzzles aren't too great either. Outside of the room where you use the gust bellows to blow sand off the floor, revealing the code to the nearby lock, that one's not bad. But man, one puzzle had me stuck for a long time. There's one room where you need to change the time, and I couldn't find the time shift stone for the life of me. Turns out you had to look through a hole in the ceiling and hit the one outside, but you could only see it at a specific angle. Let's just say I was stuck there longer than I'd like to admit. Another thing that's kind of lacking here is the enemies. You've just got your standard bokoblins, Keys, Beamos, and the little guys that hang out in the sand and spit at you. I would have expected to see more of a variety here, like the Staldras or the Armos, both of which were in the Lenu mining facility. That would have been cool, but it's just a minor complaint. Now, one thing I do like is even though this dungeon is pretty small, the way it's set up makes it feel way bigger. When I saw the dungeon map, I expected it to be a quick dungeon, but I was actually surprised with how long it took. And lastly, we have the music. It's pretty good here, and it adds to the deserted atmosphere of the Sandship. It may not be as catchy like Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple, but it works here. So overall, this dungeon isn't bad. I just feel like this one comes down to preference. If you like deserty areas and time shift stones, you'll love it. If you like cool and unique environments with variety of enemies, you might not. Next up, we have Fire Sanctuary. To me, this is the better Fire Temple in the game. Even though the Earth Temple is the Earth Temple, not the Fire Temple, it still feels like a Fire Temple, and Fire Sanctuary is better. This is the last dungeon you go to before the final dungeon, Skykeep, which is a bit weird because usually Fire Temples come early in the game, and there's something cool for the last dungeon, like City in the Sky from Twilight Princess or Stone Tower Temple from Majora's Mask. This one is just a bit underwhelming for a final dungeon. But I'm not saying this dungeon is bad. In fact, I like this dungeon a lot. You've got the inside sections of this dungeon that look pretty cool, as well as some of the outside sections, which are also super cool looking. Compared to the Earth Temple, this Fire Sanctuary has way more personality in its design. I especially like the frog guys that you need to give water to, which is a cool puzzle too in this dungeon. In certain parts you have little water plants that you can grab with your sword and throw onto the frog's tongues, usually opening up a path. But you gotta be careful not to hit the plant against something or to bust. It's pretty fun to throw it into the frog's mouth though. But beside the outside and the inside sections, we have the underground sections. In this dungeon you get the magma mitts, which are an upgrade to the digging mitts. These allow you to dig underground, and these underground sections can be really fun. At first when I saw the magma mitts were the item in this dungeon, I was a bit underwhelmed, but I was surprised by how much I actually enjoyed using them. There's some cool puzzles underground also, like hitting switches to move gates, as well as the creepy centipede enemies you need to fight. Which brings me to another thing I like about this dungeon, the mini-bosses. There are a few mini-bosses here, like the Grey Lizalfos, and my favorite, the Magma Hands. The Magma Hands were a pretty fun fight that took me a second to figure out. If you stand on the slabs in the room, they will emerge from the ground and raise you up. You'll want to get the water plants I mentioned earlier and throw it in the hands to harden them. Then smack them with your sword to break them. For some reason, I didn't think to use my sword to break them. I just figured there was something else I had to do. Like imagine getting a hammer here and using it to smash them. That would have been cool. Then we have the music here. The dungeon's theme is okay, but again, it's nothing too great. And lastly, we have the boss, which is Girahim, again. Unlike the Skyview Temple, here he is a bit tougher, but I would have preferred to have a unique dungeon boss here. I don't like how often we fight him as well as the imprisoned. It would be like if we fought Zant in the Forest Temple and the City in the Sky in Twilight Princess. Honestly, the game really suffered with the bosses. Some of them weren't so great, or it's Girahim again, which is funny because one boss here is actually really good and probably the best in the series, or at least my favorite, which we'll get to a bit later. But overall, the Fire Sanctuary is a pretty solid dungeon that I enjoyed my time in. In third place, we have the Lenu mining facility. I'm going to start by talking about how good the music for this dungeon is. This theme gets stuck in my head every time I hear it. It's so catchy and it fits the vibe of this dungeon really well. Definitely my favorite dungeon theme in the game. The Lenu mining facility is the third dungeon in this game, and it's a pretty good one. This is the first dungeon that involves time shift stones, and unlike the Sandship, I feel like here everything really comes to life when you activate the time shift stones. You've got multiple enemies like the Beamos and Centrobes, which I have a funny clip of me fighting these guys from my Skyward Sword playthrough. Ah! Oh my gosh, dude. Those things just nuked me. You also have the conveyor belts and platforms you use the gust bellows to move across gaps, which brings me to the item here, which is the gust bellow. I actually like it a lot. I'm not sure if it's a popular opinion or not, but I love using it. Although when I'm in a room full of sand, I have the urge to blow it all away until it's completely gone, which can take quite a while. With the gust bellow as well as the time shift stones, you have a lot of unique puzzles here, which makes the temple even more enjoyable. Then you have the boss Molderak. Again, another underwhelming fight. This would have been a great mini-boss though, but as a boss to a really good dungeon, not so much. It's just a scorpion and it's not even that big either. I will say the fight is pretty fun. Slicing your sword through the direction the claws pointing is pretty cool, but then he burrows under the sand and you have to use your gust bellows to blow the sand away, revealing him again. He's kinda wimpy, but the Lenu mining facility is a pretty great dungeon held back by its lackluster boss fight. In second place, we have Skyview Temple, the first temple in Skyward Sword, and what a great way to start. And it especially feels great after the insanely long introduction to this game. This dungeon has a really unique atmosphere to it. It looks like a forest temple, but parts of it gives me like a water temple vibe, or at least in the first half, especially with the bluish look to everything. You've also got some really fun and unique puzzles, which definitely make good use of the motion controls. One that really stands out is the eyes. You have to spin your sword in circles to eventually make the eye dizzy and be destroyed. Puzzles like that almost made it feel like it did playing Ocarina of Time for the first time, and everything was so new. You really have to scratch your head to figure out what to do. Then we have the item that is also new to the series, the beetle. This item was so fun to use, flying it around and search for the crystals to hit. Everything about this dungeon just felt so new for the first time and was different from previous Zelda puzzles. Another cool thing is that you come back to this dungeon later to get something, and it's a bit different. And that's something else that's kind of new, which is returning to temples. You don't really do that in previous Zelda games, unless you consider the Forsaken Fortress from Wind Waker, but I hated that place. This dungeon is just so unique, and I feel it's pretty underrated. But then we have the boss, Girahim, which, while I would have preferred a unique dungeon boss, Girahim was fine here because it was the first time we fight him. Plus, he was pretty tough and hard to figure out your first time through, which I feel like he's the reason we got 6 hearts to start in this game. But overall, a great dungeon and a great start to Skyward Sword. In first place, and my favorite dungeon in Skyward Sword, is the Ancient Sistern. This place isn't just a top tier Zelda Skyward Sword dungeon, it's one of the best in the series. Everything about this dungeon is nearly perfect, from the boss fight to the dungeon design. It's such a great time getting through. Honestly, I don't think I have a single complaint about this dungeon. The Ancient Sistern has 2 really big sections, one being the main section as soon as you enter, which feels like a water temple. Then you have the underground section that almost feels like you've entered the underworld. This section is all purple and gives off a very eerie vibe, which is a complete contrast to the peaceful feeling of the upper part. This place also has a lot of unique puzzles that can be quite challenging. One I remember getting stuck on is once you enter the underworld section, you're locked in a room. You'll need to use your whip to grab the key from the bokoblin outside. The whip is the dungeon item here, and it's a pretty good one. You can use it to grab stuff from enemies or grab stuff out of reach, as well as swing across gaps. It's pretty fun to use and really adds to the dungeon. Then we got the dungeon theme, and while not as catchy as Lenu mining facility, it fits really well here. But one of my favorite parts about this dungeon is in the underground where you have to climb the rope to get away from the zombie bokoblins. That part was so stressful, especially when they grab your feet. And to top off this incredible dungeon, we have the boss Galactos. This boss is incredible. He's like a big statue guy with 6 hands, each wielding a huge sword. Galactos will slam his swords in the ground and you'll use your newly acquired whip to unlock his hands, causing them to break. Then you pick up the swords and slash him with them. Using his swords was the coolest part. I felt like I became the boss. But it didn't last long because in his second phase, he grows feet and starts running after you. This fight is just so epic and the music is also really good. Honestly, it's probably my favorite theme in the entire game. Nintendo just went crazy with this fight, and honestly, it might be one of my favorite fights in the series, or at least top 5. But overall, this dungeon just does everything right. Great dungeon, great boss, great music, great items, great everything. It definitely shines above the rest. And there we have every Skyward Sword dungeon ranked from worst to best. Let me know your list down below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe. We're almost to 1,000 subscribers, which is crazy. Also, be sure to check out some of the other videos as well. We recently ranked Twilight Princess dungeons as well as Mario Odyssey Kingdoms. So if any of that sounds interesting, be sure to check it out. And as always, thanks for watching.